This is the Cult of Nick.
Alrighty, and welcome along to the Cult of Nick. I be Nick Margerrison. This be my podcast. Right, it's not an actual cult. It was a name that we thought was amusing in the past, and nowadays stuck with it. Here we are. And what do we do on this podcast? Well, we chat about life, the universe, and everything, the world, the wider world, maybe the world beyond the world. Who knows? We get into all sorts of different areas. And I've always enjoyed speaking to people about off the mainstream topics, off the beaten track stuff. And in the process, I've spoken to people in the distant past about something called Bitcoin. And this could be perhaps the most requested podcast I've done so far. Ever since we discussed it, lots of listeners got involved in it and then learned more about it than I know. And then suddenly came back to me thinking I knew what I was on about and that we should talk about Bitcoin again. Put it in context, it was 2013 when we talked about Bitcoin. And at that time, our Bitcoin was, I can't remember exactly, but it wasn't the kind of money we're talking about nowadays. I mean, maybe £1,000, something like that. I'm not sure. Some listeners sent me donations. We'll get into that. We'll get into Bitcoin. We'll get into all of that stuff. But before that, we're going to be looking at the wider financial world. Who are we going to be doing that with? Well, we have a fantastic guest. I've been following her work for a long time. Izabella Kaminska is going to join us. She works in financial journalism, and most famously, she was the founder editor of The Blind Spot, which is looking at financial news from a slightly different angle. Let's welcome her onto the show. Izabella, thank you for joining us here on the Cult of Nick. It's lovely to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, like I say, your background, financial journalism. I think the first time me and you started corresponding, I think you were working at the Financial Times. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. It was, I think, in the sort of COVID era.
That's right. So explain what it was that you were doing at the Financial Times.
Right. So I was at the Financial Times for 13 years. And during that time, I started off on their blog, FT Alphaville, which was a little bit like the bad boy of the news desk because we were irreverent, we were sort of self-contained, we were outside of the usual editorial hierarchy. So we got away with a lot of contrarian thought. It was a really fun place to be, and I really loved it. And then I left in 2022, that is, and because for multiple reasons, I just felt, I have to caveat everything with the fact that I do still think the FT is a great paper, and I think they do great work. By the time I left, I think the internet had done strange things to the FT. I was there, at the sharp end, seeing how the internet culture bled into conventional editorial systems. Being on the blog, I think we were very much ahead of the curve. We were like the first people there on Twitter. We understood the sort of power of Twitter. But slowly, as the rest of the newsrooms got into social media, things started to change. And by the time I left, I think the paper wasn't what it was when I joined. It was very risk averse. There was a sense of groupthink that I really found troubling, not least because I've known to be a contrarian. And I just felt it was time to branch out by myself. So that was the point of the blind spot. And really, in finance, I think it's always, historically, everyone agrees that, you have to look beyond groupthink. It's very important in finance because you can't make money if everyone's on, because you can ride the wave. But by and large, you have to be open-minded in finance because it can cost you dearly if you are a bit too blinkered. And so contrarianism is very healthy, I think, in finance, reasonable and well thought out, not you obviously can't push around any crazy theory, but you have to have a sort of disciplined contrarianism, I think. And as that became more difficult, I found it harder to be at the FT. And I thought it was time to do a sort of dedicated, independent news service that was focused on busting blind spots. And that's why it's called The Blind Spot.
I'm also a fan of contrarian thinking. I like to hear lots of different points of view. And there was a point in media where that was encouraged. And there is a point now in media where it's less encouraged because there's a lot of fear and people don't quite know what they're doing anymore. And so, it reminds me of my journey a little bit in that I feel that you were certainly at the Financial Times an outlier in your thinking, and what was a strength can become a difficulty. And if you don't want to fall out with people, then there's nothing wrong with saying, all right, well, I'm going to go and do my own thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. And so I hesitate to be disparaging about the FT because I think I've got a lot of friends there and I still think it is an amazing institution in many ways. And I don't necessarily think that what happened to the FT and many other publications was nefarious or contrived in any way. I kind of think it was like a function of the internet and how the internet bled into established institutions in weird and disruptive and destabilizing ways. And I think some people within those organizations were attuned to it and others weren't and fell into this bubble thinking trap.
Yeah, media organizations used to pride themselves on providing a plurality, a large group of different points of view. As times have changed and as the internet's emerged, it seems to me more that media organizations want everyone to be on the same page and for there to be one message. Fair enough, and that's their choice. But I'll tell you what, Izabella, and I'm looking forward to you doing this. We say to people who would like to read the Financial Times' take on the world, go and have a read. Good luck. And what I want to do is throw it over to you. I want you to try and explain to me, and I'm going to play the role here of someone who knows nothing about finance at all. What is going on at the moment? Why is it that everyone's getting all upset? Hey, who do we owe all this money to? And house prices and, why are people panicking? What is going on in the financial world at the moment from your contrarian perspective?
So it is said, it's not like it's not said, but I think it's not said very loudly in sort of more establishment circles. I think we're going through what is best described as a paradigm shift. And, we've seen these paradigm shifts in finance and economics before, most famously when the Bretton Woods system was established coming out of the war, and then when it fell apart in 1971. Now, for people who don't know what that is about, these are basic sort of international agreements that we came up with after the war to, a rule book effectively for how we were going to manage the economy and what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, what capitalism meant, or sort of democratic capitalism that won the war and how it would function and how we would rebuild those economies. And I know that sounds like a long time ago, but it does still reverberate to where we are today. And then basically those post-war systems, they worked for a while, then they didn't work, and then they collapsed in 1971 during the Nixon shock. Again, I don't want to go into the details too much, but at that point we created a new system and all those post-war rules, which were actually quite nuanced and very, there was a gold, link to the currency back then. There was acceptance for capital controls, for example, and protectionism, like this idea of, we're all now freaking out about Trumpian tariffs, but actually, capital controls, tariffs, they've been in the legacy and history of capitalist systems. They're not unheard of. What happened in 1971, though, is that we kind of broke away from that.
So Bretton Woods is the post-war agreement where a load of rules are set out about how it's going to work, trade between different countries, that kind of thing, if I'm following you correctly.
Yes, that's exactly right, yeah.
Right. Okay. And then in the 1970s, now I feel a duty to focus in on this because I have friends who can talk for hours on subjects, right? In the 1970s, they decouple the pound and the dollar from gold. Is that right? Am I on the right track here?
Yes. So basically, the Bretton Woods system had a relationship with the dollar and gold. And because the US went very quickly from a surplus country to a deficit country over the post-war period, there was a lot of pressure on that relationship. And actually, it was France that demanded that America deliver some huge amount of gold, and it would have totally drained America of its gold reserves. And so Nixon decided famously to break away. And from that moment, really, we created a new system. And unlike Bretton Woods, which Bretton Woods is named after the hotel, and it was a very, think of it like a climate change conference, or, it was bashed out over weeks, and there were lots of John Maynard Keynes was representing the UK, Harry Dexter White was representing the US, and there was many moving parts, lots of negotiations. When Nixon broke away in 1971, there was no negotiation of the new system; it just kind of emerged, and we've been on that kind of system that has no name. Some people call it the non-system. Since then, some people call it the petrodollar system, the eurodollar system. Those are all very complex terms, but essentially I think the easiest way to think of it is that it's a system that had very few rules, and that really came into its own when Margaret Thatcher and Reagan were in power, and they leaned into that sort of rule as like laissez-faire, which means sort of let it be, let trade be what it is system. And ever since then, the only people who've really tried to protect their economies are the Asian countries like China and to some degree Japan, and well, actually Japan quite a lot. And those are the two big players. And one could also argue the EU has emerged as a protectionist bloc in its own right. So whilst we were being told that laissez-faire was all very great and everyone should have free trade, at the same time, those open systems had to kind of respond to the other players that were still happy to be closed systems, and there was an asymmetry. And I think when your opening question was like, where are we today? I think that asymmetry has now kind of the tension between that asymmetry between the free economies and open economies and the closed economies. It's got to this point where the imbalances are so great in the system that the system is in a stress point. So it's not just, and this is very important because I think sometimes in the UK, everyone thinks it's just a UK thing. And I don't think it's communicated well enough in the UK press that this is not just a UK thing. Like there is simultaneous pressure going on in Europe, in America, in Japan, the entire kind of West, Canada, Australia's facing its issues. So it's a kind of Western system point of potential single failure. But simultaneously, it is also a huge problem for China. And the Russian economy has its own issues. But those are kind of the big power players. And that's where we are today.
All right, let me parrot that back at you in my own style and see again if I'm following you. Am I right in thinking that the Bretton Woods thing, they meet up, they agree the rules of the financial game, then in the 70s, Nixon sort of autonomously on his own decides that actually dollars don't equal a certain amount of gold. And that's because I don't know how many people, I certainly don't have a living memory of looking at my £10 note and thinking that it had a direct relationship with gold. I mean, obviously you couldn't have got £10 of gold for a £10. What was the relationship between? In fact, help me there. Let's go in a time machine back into the past. What is that relationship between gold and money? How would that work? Could I turn up and give a pound note in and get a pound of gold from my bank, or give me some more detail on it? I can't imagine it.
There's been like lots of different systems throughout the financial history of the world, and different, countries have had different sort of treatments of gold and silver, and you've had periods of more money printing and paper money and gold. So it's hard to generalize, but like in the Bretton Woods system, there was also a gold system before the war as well, and that also collapsed. Gold has a problem. Gold-backed systems have a problem because they tend to not be very elastic, and what that means is that they're quite constraining because you can't print gold, and people think that's a good thing. But actually, if your economy is growing and you have like people are busy, there's all sorts of economic activity. If you don't have enough money, that can constrain growth, and it can lead to a depression because you can't get enough liquidity to allow people to redistribute the wealth. Like the wealth concentrates in very specific hands. Unless you print, you need to balance the amount of liquidity to the amount of growth. So there is a false perception that money printing is always bad. I don't think it is always bad. It's always relative to growth and how we are doing in the economy at large. If the rate of money expands more quickly than the rate of growth, then you potentially get inflation. But if it's the other way around, if there's suddenly a shock and there's a contraction in the amount of liquidity, especially if it's a debt-induced system, then you can get a very dangerous depression. And I guess a lot of people are worried that we're now at that point again because all that money printing that we've done, fundamentally, there is now an imbalance in the amount of money relative to how much growth there is. And gold is a very attractive proposition because through the years, its value is, 80,000, I want to say 80,000 years or something. I mean, who knows, like prehistoric. It's a long term asset. So even if it is a bubble, and a lot of economists think it's a bubble and it doesn't make any money, it has a sort of sense of like, I don't know, we just have an intrinsic understanding of its value. But it does have a problem because it doesn't yield anything because it's gold, which means it just hangs about in your safe. And it's very difficult to lend gold because gold is heavy and you don't want to lend it around. And coins these days are just, the gold is worth too much to make a coin out of it. So paper money is just more practical and it allows you to lend it around. If you lend money, unlike gold, you can then have a yield. And yield is very important because yield is something that allows for growth. This is the fundamental part of the relationship between gold and money. Was always supposed to keep too much money printing in check, but sometimes it would backfire, ensure there wasn't enough money printing. So you've got to have a sweet spot like Goldilocks.
In a weird way, I kind of can't help but put it into a comical past where it's the Middle Ages and some wizard has had a brilliant idea that rather than paying the peasants in a lump of gold every month, you give them a piece of paper, tell them it's worth a lump of gold, they believe it, and suddenly you've got loads of lumps of gold you can build an army with. I can imagine the wizard and the king laughing as they go, look, they've bought it, they believe in this idea. So there's something a bit odd and mystical about money.
That is exactly the heart of what's going on, because as soon as you want mobility and money, famously, like a lot of people say, it's the original social network and it has to flow through the economy, but the physical properties of gold make that difficult. But the same applied to conventional money. And actually, the original PayPal was the Medicis who set themselves up as money transmitters in the Renaissance period. And that movement of money through the system created a trust deficit because you had to be sure that your bank counterpart who was issuing these notes against the underlying capital, which was in that case very often gold, that you could trust them that they would have that gold. And that's where the trust-based banking system came out of. And whenever we have bank panics or bank collapses, it's usually an iteration of what you're talking about, where you realize, oh, hang on, maybe they don't have the gold, but it's not gold. It's just these days it's a gold sort of representation, but it's the same process.
That awful possible moment where money's, well, let's change the phrasing, the tone on that and say worth less. And let's put some meat and veg on this picture that we're building, because before lockdown, I think a steak from Marks and Spencer's it was under £10. I'm not sure the exact figure. It was under £10 because I remember thinking, oh, almost £10.
Yeah.
And now, only yesterday, I bought the same sort of steak and it's exactly £20. So it feels to me like my money is worth less than it was, right? That's just true, isn't it? That's what's happened. They printed loads of, and because there's more money, well, it's not worth as much, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes you have to print money. That's all very well and good, but you also have to make sure it gets invested in the right places. So you can print money and it can create growth if it's well invested. But if it's badly invested, it can just like compound the problem and then lead to what I think, my go-to example is post, the communist era in Poland or in Russia in the 1980s, where the fundamental problems in the economy were just not being sorted out. The temptation to print money was very high. And so you ended up with an economy of shortage where effectively there was essentially no way to get your hands on any goods. So prices were going up and up and up. It could be that we are in a similar situation to that now.
It's certainly, I'm not saying it's worthless. I'm still happy to have any money that anyone wants to send me, right? but worth less. Yeah, it seems to have maybe nearly halved in value. Now, I mentioned before we got into this conversation that there's another aspect to this, and that's Bitcoin or what people call cryptocurrency. Now, I don't want anyone to misunderstand here. I am not an expert in this, and none of this is financial advice. This is a conversation between two people about a strange world. So we're not doling out advice to anybody. But 2013, I don't know how much Bitcoin was worth, but it wasn't anything like it's worth now. And back then I mentioned it. I interviewed a few people about it. I thought it was interesting. And some listeners sent me some Bitcoin, which at the time wasn't worth much. And I was very grateful, and I looked into it, and I got a little wallet and put my donations in there. And now it's worth quite a lot of money. I say quite a lot of money. I mean, it started off in small change, now maybe a few £1,000s. But what is that? I've just started using it. I put it on Coinbase, right? I bought a fridge. A mate of mine said, treat it like a bank. It says always have the same amount in, and if you take some money out, make sure you pay it back. So I thought, all right, I'll try that. I'm going to buy a fridge. I bought a fridge, and then the price of Bitcoin has gone down. So I bought back my Bitcoin, but when I bought it back, it wasn't as much money as the fridge. It was a few £100 less. But I don't really understand what I'm doing. So do you want to explain Bitcoin, Izabella? Do you want to tell me how it works and why it is that I can take out some money, buy a fridge, and then pay back less and still have the same amount of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, that's very lucky. I think over the course of Bitcoin's history, a lot of people might have had the opposite experience. I think Bitcoin is it's a new type of money. At first, when it came out, a lot of people didn't think it was valuable at all. They thought it was a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme and it would implode. I was one of those people, to be fair. And that's because when something's too good to be true, I usually feel like I really have to kick the tires on something. And so I was very critical for a long time, but not ideologically. I just felt like I needed to really scrutinize it. And I do think at the time it wasn't perfect, and there were, anyway, we won't get into the details, but it's evolved a lot since then. But by and large, I would say, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a kind of virtual representation of gold in many ways. It's a system for clearing international currency or currency in general with strangers without needing to depend on a third party. And that's really the revolutionary bit of the technology, is that what we described before, this like fear that if you give out tokens against your gold or whatever, and you use third parties, which you need to do if you want to send money across like time and space, that they might defraud you. And then it turns out that these paper slips are worth nothing because the thing that they said that was backing them isn't really there. And Bitcoin kind of solves that problem because it engineers a kind of game where it apportions tokens to everybody involved in the game, and it has a predetermined sort of agreement between everyone, like we all have these shares in this system called Bitcoin, and we will use this like rationing system to move those Bitcoins around. But unlike any other system, we don't have to depend on the bank or a third party because we use technology and very complicated mathematics to make sure that every 10 minutes we know there's like a snapshot of the whole system that comes up, and it tells you where everybody's money is based on how energy has been apportioned and calculations have been made. And if you want to move money, it's like, every 10 minutes, your money might be here 1 minute and then it'll be somewhere else. And how it moves is down to how much energy you're prepared to spend to move that Bitcoin. You don't need to trust anyone. You just have to commit to spending some energy. If you don't have the means to mine, they call it mining, that's the process that allows you to win Bitcoins. And in the process of winning those Bitcoins, you are contributing to this snapshot. The key point is that this snapshot is every few minutes and it allows you to not depend on the banks. It is quite revolutionary.
Here's what I said back in 2013, having had it explained to me by someone. And I wonder if I'm right or not. I felt what they were saying is it was like, imagine a giant mathematical equation that exists on the internet that's super clever and complicated. And let's call it, it's like a Rubik's Cube. And as the Rubik's Cube gets moved, that's the Bitcoins moving about. Then you can buy some of that Rubik's Cube and hold on to it. And at the moment, well, back then, it was worth, like, say, 20 quid? I don't know, 30 quid, not much. But what I got told at the time is that if you could own just one Bitcoin, then there's only 21 million of them in the world, and they can't do what they've done with money, where they print loads more. So those are the bits that I sort of understood. And I guess maybe thanks to some of the listeners, I've got a little bit of that Rubik's Cube, and it helped me buy a fridge.
Well, I think that's a really good explanation of the process, that Rubik's Cube, as I said, they call it mining. But you can either acquire Bitcoins through mining or you can buy them through the secondary market. So these are Bitcoins that already exist and other people that are prepared to effectively sell you their shares of the Bitcoin puzzle. And the reason it goes up in value is because people think that that service is valuable. And as you say, there's only so many of these Bitcoins outstanding. So as more and more people find that service valuable, then naturally supply and demand is such that it'll go up in price. However, it's not guaranteed to go up in price. It's all a function of wider economics and also the value of the dollar and all these other kind of, if the Fed, which is the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of America, or the Central Bank of the UK, the Bank of England starts printing money, then in theory, the bull case for Bitcoin is that will create more conventional money, which will make those, that small amount of Bitcoins more and more valuable. But it could also be that, like, if there's a massive debt overhang and we have a, collapsing, not just number of money, but velocity of money. And this is very important because money isn't just about how much there is out there. It's also how quickly it travels through the economy. And sometimes you can have a lot of money, but it's not moving very quickly. And that has potentially a deflationary effect as well. And if that happens, then Bitcoin might actually, if there's a sort of liquidity shortage, as they describe it in the conventional space, then Bitcoin can go down in value. And that's actually what's happening right now, because right now we have concerns about what they call liquidity. And whenever there's a liquidity crisis, historically, this has become a pattern. The first area that gets tapped is the sort of high, most risky capital class. And that turns out it's crypto, or mainly, I think within the crypto universe, you've got Bitcoin, which is like the gold of crypto. But then there's, can I say shitcoin on this podcast?
Yeah.
All the kind of shitcoins have the lesser values. They're usually the ones that first get liquidated. And then Bitcoin has held its own a bit more, but it taps money out of that, what I would call the swing liquidity buffer in the system. I think of it like, I feel like Bitcoin is a bit like fat on a human body. It's the first bit that's going to get tapped when you need more energy. But it's also the first place you put your excess energy when times are good. So when there's a lot of liquidity in the system, a lot of it will go in Bitcoin. Bitcoin will go up in price. But when the system needs to draw on that liquidity, it can go down. But overall, as the system shifts, I think over time, if you believe in the Bitcoin narrative, then the system may, over time, move to more of this sort of cryptographically defended non-bank system. Then the trend is going to be up, but with lots of intervals, cyclical, you could call them cyclical drawdowns, because the economy is said to be cyclical. So you have periods of growth, periods of contraction, up and down. It's like a business cycle thing.
Yeah, I guess I'm just looking at it now, and it was on Monday, the 6th of October, it was £91,000 for a Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas as of today, on the day that we're recording this, it's at £67,000. So if someone had a whole Bitcoin, they would have, I guess they'd feel like they'd lost £30,000 now.
Yeah. That's why it's important to be aware that it's a very volatile investment. Up until recently, the volatility had been coming down. It had been trading pretty consistently and quite low volatility relative to gold and other asset classes. But then it always does its thing. Just when you least expect it, it does something crazy. And they call it crypto winter when that drawdown happens.
So just to put a bit of extra detail on the picture here, we mentioned shitcoins. Now, as I understand it, after Bitcoin, you had a bunch of other people with pretty much the same idea, like literally the same code, who said, oh no, we've invented an ETH coin or a Trump coin or whatever it is. And there's lots of them. Whereas I don't even know how serious to take Bitcoin. So I don't know how seriously to take all the other stuff. But there are other options here. But it starts to feel with me, if people talk to me about this subject too much, then I have to screen them out, because I assume I'm talking to someone who really may as well be talking about betting on the horses.
I think that's correct. I think, I changed my tune because I was this terribly well-known critic for a long time, but I changed my tune on Bitcoin around 2020, actually, because I saw it as, for a long time I trusted the state and I thought that the state would be able to deal with most crises and it was best placed to deal with more crises. But my confidence in the state to manage crises kind of fell apart a little bit in 2020. I realized that actually it's worth having this backup system, which is Bitcoin, because there is no other failsafe and it is the only international global backup system in the event something really horrific happens to the global financial system. So I kind of recast myself as a doom coiner. However, it is true that even though, so there's a range, the crypto universe is made up of different sort of factions. And one of those factions is the Bitcoin maxis or maximalists, and they love crypto, but only Bitcoin. They think everything else is rubbish and they think everything else is gambling. And shitcoins especially are just, mostly pump and dump schemes. Like the famous ones are FTX, falling apart. What else was there? There's been loads of them. And I think it is a bit like gambling. It's theoretically limitless. But the same applies to shares of stocks or any other, there are many different financial assets that have a limitless potential. And that's why you get these booms and busts. And those booms and busts, the sort of necessary component of confidence in the market, sort of like those good years when you're like, yeah, we can go, go, go. And then a correction when overinvestment or investment in the wrong things, and you have to kind of, the economy has to sort itself out. But that kind of habitual correction is very good for the system because it allows it to purge misallocated investments or like a forest cleansing every now and then, it's clearing rather. And so shitcoins are very dangerous because they're usually the place where capital gets misallocated first. But occasionally, who knows, maybe there are some ideas, like Ethereum came out of the shitcoin universe. I mean, some people still refer to Ethereum as their shitcoin. I think Ethereum has, which is another rival system, but it has functionality on top of it that allows you to program different tokens. There are interesting opportunities for those sorts of coins to become a new type of company share class or some sort of mechanism for raising money for small and medium-sized business especially. And I think if we get to a climate where we can encourage small and medium-sized companies to raise money and invest in themselves, that might be a good thing. One other faction, or rather one other trend that I think is worth just flagging is the rise of stable coins, which are like crypto, but they're backed by conventional currencies. And they were engineered to allow people who have exposure to crypto to be able to take gains. So stablecoins were invented to do that because it was very difficult to get money out of the crypto ecosystem because it was unbanked, and therefore a lot of banks didn't want to let you cash out. So I'm impressed you managed to get a fridge because that would have been the challenge point.
Yeah, I mean, it's only in the last month. I've never touched it prior to that. I don't really understand it. I just know that the bottom line figure looks quite impressive, but I couldn't ever connect it to the real world. Whereas now you can do these websites, Coinbase and stuff like that, and you can just tank it out, can't you? But the thing with Bitcoin's always seemed very hypothetical to me until maybe the last 5 years or so. And it's inextricably intertwined with ideas that I enjoy but don't take too seriously, which are kind of conspiranoid. World's going to end. They're going to crash the money system. This is going to be the data that goes inside the microchip that you're going to have to wear in some dystopian Orwellian future. It's all wrapped up in that world for me. So seeing it manifest into the real world and being discussed on financial news sites and so on, and just a normal news story. Yeah, we're just talking about Bitcoin today. It's super strange because it definitely comes from, that conspiranoid world. It certainly started off there, didn't it? I mean, it seemed to. It was very popular back in the day.
Well, the origins of Bitcoin are very mysterious. They remain mysterious. I mean, I have my own favorite conspiracy theory about, I don't know if it's a conspiracy, some of it is an informed conspiracy, I don't know what you'd call informed conspiracy, speculation, I guess. But So there's been for ages, I think, since that 1971 shock that we were talking about, a large amount of people were very upset that that happened, and they have never given up on the idea of making currency hard again. And that's really, so when you hear about hard currency, that's the pre-1971 system. And, they would say that anything post-1971 was just fiat currency, not hard, not worth its salt. So are they right? I think a lot of them are perpetually kind of, they're kind of Scrooge McDucky, because they're always worried about, the end of the world and and we have to hoard all this wealth. Well, that's all very well and good, but the economy doesn't grow if everyone just looks after their own. We have to have some level of cooperation, and we have to invest in other people. And if you just hoard your money, it doesn't grow. And I think that was one of the major misunderstandings in 2008, when people thought, your money's in the bank and that money is really there and it's yours and you can take it out anytime. And I don't think they realized that actually the whole process of the modern banking system is a mechanism by which we kind of very efficiently manage people's excess liquidity in ways that when you're not using it, somebody else can use it, right? And because you're lending it to someone, you get a return, and that's why you have interest in the bank. Now, if you don't want interest, you want total security, and you want to make sure you have 100% recoverable money at any time, and you don't have third-party exposure to a bank. Well, now you can buy a stable coin, which is a pound stable coin or a dollar stable coin. That's been very popular. But I think back in 2008, people didn't really understand that. They just genuinely, I spoke to many people who were like, why doesn't the bank have my money? I don't understand. What, did it steal it? And it's like, well, yes and no. Banks have this privilege to be able to do that, and they're very heavily regulated now to, ensure that when they do re-lend your money, that they do so in a very prudent way. But there has been a downside from that regulation, which is that banks don't take as much risk anymore. And as a result, I think a lot of the economic stagnation we've had is related to this sort of fact that banks are very prudent now, and they're not what they were before 2008. And so there are downsides to that very kind of risk-averse mentality. Or they see more opportunity lending abroad, where there's more growth or where there's different dynamics. And that way, our capital gets sucked out of this country and invested abroad instead of in our own economy. And that is one of the problems we have. That's one of the problems I think that Trump is actually trying to address with the tariffs. And, it's about rebalancing the global system.
But can I ask you on this banks thing? I mean, I'm really curious about this, because these are just things that I've heard in the past and never really understood. But if it's the case that I put, say, £1,000 in the bank, am I right in thinking that entitles them to lend £4,000 out or something like that? Is it a 4-to-1 ratio? It's something like that, isn't it? They don't have to have all of the money that they've available, in their coffers, right? Am I completely mad there?
No. So you are right, but it's a bit more complex. Before 2000, everything changes after 2008 with the new Basel 3 rule book. So before 2008, banks had a lot more capacity to just relend. And I think in the UK, for example, in the UK, that reserve was actually zero from a bank reserve perspective, from a central bank reserve perspective. But the capital, which is different to the reserves, that's how much of their own money they have, to back all that lending. So it's the banks are in the business of borrowing your money and lending it to other people, right? And when that goes wrong, they can either pay for that out of your money, which is not optimal because they owe it back to you, or they can pay for it out of their own money. And their own money is the capital in the business. And that capital, post-2008, the regulators decided that we have to have a lot more capital than we used to have, so that if things do go wrong, the banks pay for it out of their own, the shareholders pay for it, not the people whose money they're relending. Right, so that's number one.
That's why they're all closing down, is it? Because there's not a bank in where I live anymore. My bank's closed down.
Well, so there are other cost pressures on banks.
Yeah.
Generally, I mean, generally speaking, after 2008, they had their wings really clipped and they weren't able to do the big brash money creation stuff that they used to be able to do. I think a fundamental misunderstanding is that banks lend money that already exists. They don't. They lend first. They literally engineer money out of thin air, and then they so-called fund that position. That has always been the historical way that banks have operated. So it's like creating your own crypto coin and then finding a way to fund it with money afterwards if somebody wants their money back who has bought it. But banks have also now got other regulations like liquidity ratios and leverage ratios. So they're now very constrained in how much risk they can take. So you are right that they can lend a portion of your money out, and now they retain much more de facto capital and much more reserve-wise. It's got complicated because of QE, which is quantitative easing, and there's a general amount of excess reserves to ensure there's liquidity in the system. But
let me interrupt you there, because I've been told quantitative easing, you can say that quicker by saying money printing. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It is effectively money printing, but I've always described it more as an asset swap, but it's a function of our modern economy. Again, it's like, we do print money, but again, sometimes that money printing is justified because the growth of the system needs that money. And so I caution against just like saying money printing, but I think it is money printing because you're creating literally like a cryptocurrency company. You're creating units out of thin air. Now, but a company who issues shares does exactly the same thing, and those shares are then pledgeable assets against which they can raise money. It's just that the shares of the central bank we use the shares that the central bank issues as money. Because the reason we do that is because it's a central counterparty between all of us, and we kind of trust it because we all have to pay taxes to the government. And so we know it'll never go down. And there's some sort of democratic oversight over it. So therefore, like by and large, we need a liquidity rail that we have a kind of common denominator with everybody. Don't challenge me on this in terms of like the actual rudimentary facts because I'm being a bit broad brush, but effectively we use those shares. And those shares are often backed by different assets or foreign exchange because shares have a market value. So if you print too many shares, like companies do this all the time, they come to market and they think there's going to be more demand for their shares than there is. And then rather than popping at the IPO, the share price collapses, right? So, and also if you have, central banks sometimes want to have, they have like, they don't. They do and they don't, but historically they have had targets, and so they want to defend the pound, and so they need foreign reserves then to go and buy back their shares effectively from the market to keep them supported. And that's how we basically exited the ERM currencies that we ran out of foreign exchange. And what's interesting about that is that was the famous incident that created George Soros as a billionaire, because he was the one that punted on the fact that the Bank of England would run out of foreign exchange to defend the value of the pound. So central banks they are special, but they fundamentally take a punt with how much money they print relative to the economic conditions. And if the economic conditions in theory justify it, then they do it. But I think personally, they've got it a bit wrong recently. So I think there's a general consensus that whilst it was justified to print that money in 2008, because the system would have just gridlocked and we would have had no cash in the banks and ATMs would have run dry and panic would have ensued and we didn't have a backup system at all. So I think it was justifiable for them to do that money printing at that time. What a lot of economists these days say is that they shouldn't have continued doing it for as long as they did. And that was what created a sort of massive misallocation of capital, because fundamentally it created a subsidy for banking. And so banks have since then, people like to say that China, has an industrial policy and subsidizes its manufacturing at the public level, which it does. We do the same, but we do it for financial services.
Okay, so this is putting in context lockdown and this period where, like I say, I've got my little Bitcoin that listeners have sent me that's not worth too much. And then it started going up in value around about the time that they were doing lockdown and quantitatively easing, I guess. And it also contexts a conversation I had with a friend who got very excited and said, oh no, it's not that Bitcoin's going up in value. It's that money is going to go to zero. It's going down in value. That's what's actually happening. The economy's going down. And that's why your stake is double the price. And that's why Bitcoin's doubled in price. And so as a result, whenever Bitcoin goes up, I always feel a bit worried maybe that is going to happen and maybe the economy is going to crash. And I mean, could that ever happen? A world where money itself is, let alone Bitcoin, money itself is not worth anything?
I think technically, I mean, hard to say. I would say
Very likely. Let's put that on the table. Yeah.
actually it is possible that you have an international global financial crisis. I think nowadays, because we have Bitcoin, which really can't go offline in the same way, I think it wouldn't be like 2008. But also, I think valuation of money could change, but I don't think money would disappear because, and this is why when everyone was like really, I wanted to say slagging off Liz Truss, I don't know, being critical of Liz Truss, I was really, my contrarian streak was very much like, oh my gosh, come on, look outside the window, get some perspective. You just have to fly around the world. And despite all the problems we have in the UK is still a very functional economy. Like these comparisons to the UK being a total basket case, I think that was excessive. And I think, don't get me wrong, we have massive problems and we have to sort them out. But on the grand sort of global, on the grand scale, I think it was massively overdone. And I do think she was slightly stitched up. That's my own personal opinion. It's not a political position. It's just merely, the analysis of this situation as it was then. I think she was unfairly blamed for what happened. But I think her plan was probably, something that Rachel Reeves will end up having to do anyway, but we'll see. So, and money go to zero. So that was like the moment, like, oh, the pound is trash. But it will never go to zero because we have like all economies are worth something, even the world's worst economy, or even like, say, for example, a country like Lebanon that used to be incredibly rich and powerful and has a sort of richest to rags story, intermittent blackouts, all sorts of challenges in terms of its economy, but it's not gone to zero. Even Ukraine, like that's probably like one of the worst case scenarios for any country. Money didn't go to zero. Even when you look at World War II, money didn't go to zero. There was always some value left, right? It was just how you apportioned it, where you put it, and how you could access it. That changed. And maybe the value of money might have changed, or maybe it might have been, different people would have lost money and some would have made money. So it would have been reallocated. But even the worst of times, money doesn't disappear. Money doesn't disappear. But yeah, it doesn't exist either. It's a social construct.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it kind of is, isn't it? And yeah, Liz Truss is an interesting one because I know that friends of mine thought her plans were absolutely fantastic. And again, listen, I don't know anything about it, so I don't have any opinion other than it's curious to me that she, someone who's got a background in conspiranoid thinking, right? It was curious to me that she sort of goes into office and leaves office sounding like a conspiracy theorist at the end of it. I mean, some of the stuff she wrote in the Times and so on afterwards, she gave the impression that she wasn't in charge and she was the prime minister.
Yeah. And I personally, I think, I have a lot of sympathy for her position because I think I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's in plain sight. I mean, the Bank of England is forged to be independent. Like that is the whole point and purpose of the Bank of England. We have, and a lot of the institutions that she has an axe to grind with, like the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they also were created to be independent. And so we celebrate their independence, but we sometimes forget what independence means, which means the outsourcing of democratic powers to independent alternative bodies, right? The other extreme perspective on that, which is like, oh, the Federal Reserve is a private bag, and because there's always a contradiction somewhere in that conspiratorial mindset. Like on one hand, the Fed is this evil, private bank, but at the same time, it's also like the government, state evil money. So you can't have it both ways. Which one is it? And actually, the reality is that central banks are devised to be independent checks on fiscal policy, but they are also they're not entirely independent because the government does have some powers over who it appoints to key roles in central banks. But, it is a mechanism by which a lot of government power is sort of transferred away. So she wasn't wrong on that, I would say.
Yeah. Adam Curtis describing Bill Clinton being elected in, I think, Bitter Lake. But yeah, it was, I think, in that one, Bitter Lake, where he talks about Clinton getting elected and then being told in no uncertain terms that all his big ideas he's got and all his new policies he's got can't happen because you can't afford it. And I can so picture that, getting into politics. I'm sure I'm not suggesting he was completely naive, but, I can picture that sitting in a room and having a man explain to me that there's no money. That's been my life. A man explaining to me that there's no money. My fear perhaps is that I buy some Bitcoin or I put some money in the bank and then a man in a suit will come along and explain to me for reasons that I don't understand. I don't have any money. There's been a financial crash, or, oh yeah, Core 30 didn't work out, or I don't, something that I know nothing about that relates to the money. That's my relation. That's why I avoid men in suits, I think, because they tend to tell me I don't have any money. But
yeah, I think that is everyone's fear. I mean, I think we have to remember that money is an abstraction, yeah? And it, as you said, it's a social construct, but what is it an abstraction of? It's an abstraction of real world goods and services, all the great stuff we have accessible at any point in the shops, in information services and services more broadly. And we just have these tokens that we have agreed are going to get you certain amounts of, services or goods at certain different value points. And also on top of that, we have another social contract where we determine how public goods are paid for. And those public goods are, who has to pay more and what kind of people doing what jobs have the biggest burden to pay. And that's the fiscal side of it, right? So you have these two social contracts, and sometimes the people who determine like how public goods are paid for have a very different perspective to the people who are managing how many tokens there should be to be able to consume goods and services as they really are, right? And it's the clash between those systems. So that's basically me saying an abstraction of like the fiscal power and the monetary power. And they're supposed to be in a kind of mutually beneficial tension with each other because one keeps the other one straight, right? That's the intended logic there. But sometimes these things go wrong because either the state is too powerful, or in this case, to bring it back to today, I think we've gone from an era of financialization, we're being politicized again. So fiscal power is really making a comeback because the central banks are at the limits of what they can conceivably do. And the reason the central banks are now at the limits of what they can do is because the costs of all their money printing started to come home after COVID, as you noticed when the stakes started going up in price. Because inflation is ultimately the golden rule that the independence of the central bank is anchored to. So if they fail on so-called price stability, then they lose their reputation, they lose their credibility, and then the political impetus to bring back the central bank and the control of the money back under the state's control is very much there. And at that point, fiscal power has much more power than monetary power.
I really like the analogy of money being like a social network, and Bitcoin as well. And maybe we could include the shit coins in there. They're all different social networks. If we use that analogy, I guess money feels like maybe Facebook. Everyone uses it. No one likes it. But, you can interact with your friends and family and that that's what they use as well. Whereas Bitcoin feels a little bit like X. No one I know in my real life seems to use it. Whereas I enjoy it a lot more, connect with more interesting people on it. But at the same time, if we take that analogy, there are people who are talking about things like civil war, the tensions in this country ramping up, sectarianism, all that kind of stuff. I can't help but see Bitcoin as one side of an oncoming conflict, and Facebook, the old school monetary system, on another side of a conflict. And I don't want to take sides. I'd quite happy having both. But am I wrong on that? Do you know, I get the feeling that in the air, there's this sort of, particularly with Trump talking about, and the type of people that are into Bitcoin as well. And so I want to be super clear here. I'm not into those, the Bitcoin bros. I don't necessarily want them to be in charge. I'm picturing some sort of oncoming civil war that involves crypto bros on one side and normies on the other.
Is there a civil war coming of any variety? I hope not. I fear that things are going to get more tense before they maybe get better. But will it lead to a sort of ideological schism in society where everyone thinks they have the just cause and it goes to a sort of hot war? I don't know. I hope we can come together and not end up in that very polarized future, that effectively what happened in Ukraine. But is it going to involve the Bitcoin bros? I don't see them as the sort of people who are going to pick up arms. I think they're libertarians and they're very, laissez-faire. And so if anything, they're the sort of people who would rather just like, oh, well, this country's not working for me. I'm going to go and start up a new country and I'm going to find ways to... but they won't annex it with guns and military equipment and a coup. I think they will just hack it. And that's happening already. There are a bunch of little autonomous states that are, that they are, there's one, I think, there's a Czech guy who's the head of Liberland. Like that's somewhere, I think, off the Adriatic coast, somewhere near Croatia, I think. And, they just found this island that wasn't being used and they decided, very much like, Occupy Wall Street, when they just, there have been many sort of attempts to create autonomous little republics. I think the Bitcoiners are more likely to do that, or seasteading, or find a kind of technological way or a hack to annex territory, or they might even buy like an island, like who knows. Yeah. They tried to buy a boat, that sailed around the world called the Satoshi. So I don't think they're revolutionary in the sense of we're going to like start a war. I think if anyone is going to start a war, it's probably going to be, the prevailing. Yeah.
I mean, like I say, I wouldn't want to take a side, but it feels like these are big ideological differences. I mean, the printing money thing, when I first heard about that when I was younger, it annoyed me because I understand if there's less of something, it's worth more. If you print more, it's worth less. That's irritating because once you get your head around it, so that's a big thing. If Bitcoin actually does provide a financial system that people can use, and they're not going to print any more Bitcoin, that cuts right to the heart of politics, doesn't it? Because almost every political idea seems to hinge around how much more money we need to print.
Yes. And I think Bitcoin definitely has a role to play. It's established itself, and I see it more as a sort of the new international clearing unit that takes over from the IMF, which was a product of Bretton Woods, right? I think it's important to understand that regime failed because there wasn't a universal anchor that was portable and could fulfill the post-war agenda that was being laid out through Pax Americana, where the US was printing a lot of dollars and actually not doing it. The big secret that I think many normies, if you call, not to be dismissive, but like normies don't appreciate. So all those dollars that we bailed out in 2008, they weren't printed by the Fed. They were printed often by European banks that were doing their own kind of equivalent of crypto, but without the crypto. They were doing it in conventional old school money, but they were doing it outside of the remit of the Fed. So these were very much black market. In some ways, they were black market dollars, but they were called euro dollars. And in theory, the Fed couldn't control it. So that was one of the problems. And so these unlicensed institutions were creating all these dollars, but and drawing down on the gold And the real question was like, how did the dollars get into Europe in the first place to be able to do that? Well, it was through physical pallets of cash, often because the Americans were engaged in wars in places like Vietnam or wherever, and they were sending money to their soldiers, and those dollars, rather than repatriating back to America, they ended up in Swiss bank accounts. And then the Swiss basically and the British then helped cultivate, like they use that as seed capital to then do your trick that you were talking about, where you only need like $1 and you can lend out 99% of it. And so those were the dollars that were impossible to constrain and then effectively imposed on the system in 2008. And meanwhile, the likes of China were like, okay, well, this international rule thing, it doesn't really apply to us. And they were printing their own money. And so everyone was kind of printing money. I don't think it's necessarily fair to just blame it squarely on the Fed. But the Bitcoin now ensures, if there's a standard that's anchored to Bitcoin, then there is a mobile asset that can constrain these sort of bad tendencies, because it would become immediately visible if money printing that was sort of at the institutional level of stuff that like balances the books between countries, if that was being subverted, as it was for a long time before. So I think that's the real potential of Bitcoin, to be like the thing that keeps all the different states that don't trust each other in check, and so that they can't just undermine each other, rather than like, you know, doing industrial policy. Because a lot of the industrial policy that allowed China to build up all those reserves was funded through effectively money printing. So that's the issue.
We can't do that with Bitcoin, digital gold, as people call it. I think they call it digital gold because everyone knows gold is real money.
Well, except that the interesting thing about gold is that, you know, there is lots of gold out there. So it's now, you know, there's a lot of countries still have a lot of gold to dig up. So it's not as, in some ways, Bitcoin is more scarce than gold.
Oh, yeah, because I suppose they print more gold when they pull it out of the ground, don't they? But you know what? I've really enjoyed chatting to you, and I hope that's made sense to the audience. And I'm going to underline that we're not giving financial advice to everyone. But how do people find your work? How do they follow up on these conversations? I want them to fall in love with your work. How do we do that?
Oh, well, thank you. Please head over to my website, which is the-blindspot.com. But I am in the process of migrating to Substack. So over there, I'm Mind the Blind Spot on Substack, or the-blindspot.com.
All right. I'll tell you what we'll do as well. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And yeah, thanks for joining us, and thanks for downloading The Cult of Nick.